Well, we're glad to have another episode of Things Hidden today, and that's we're joined by Darren Beattie, who's the editor and founder of Revolver.news, which has been really making a lot of big waves right now with some of the news stories that have been the buzz, much to the chagrin of the DC establishment that doesn't like some of the narratives that Darren's been putting out there into the ether. So thanks for joining me, Darren.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, what's interesting about you is you've got a foot both in the intellectual, you come from academia, but you also like doing kind of the populist style, mainstream news cycle fight too. What do you like more? Do you like the big picture stuff, thinking about the big idea stuff, or do you like the news cycle drama?
I enjoy both, and I think they're mutually reinforcing. I am a strenuous opponent of the middle brow, but I enjoy the highbrow and the lowbrow alike, and think that it can come up. It's an interesting combination for sure, to have the highbrow and the lowbrow, and to have written a dissertation on Heidegger and also to have written the Thanksgiving turkey speech for President Trump. They both go together.
They fit together on the two sides of the same coin.
Something like that.
So, I want to talk again, a big picture, and then we can talk about some of the news stories that you guys have been publishing of recent time. You've been looking at the Capitol event, what happened there with January 6th. You've been investigating some of the blunders around previous, terror plots and some of the strange patterns that we've seen over the years. So we can get into some of those specifics, but just starting off in the big picture view, I call this show Things Hidden because I like to examine kind of the anthropological side of how we got here, which is that's a quite big view. People are like, we don't have time to talk about ritual cannibalism. We've got, critical theory to battle, but I think it's important to see how these things might connect. And so when I wanted to have you on, I wanted to kind of get you to think about how did we get here? You call this establishment in DC, the globalist American empire. You talk about its religious characteristics. A lot of people talk about it now. It's become very, to talk about it as a cathedral, as a religion. And of course, the left describes the hardcore MAGA people as part of a cult too. So both sides see the other as part of this kind of cultic religious fervor. Let's start with that. Why do you think people are now seeing the religiosity of politics in this time? We didn't really talk about politics as religion, say in 2004 or, the 90s or something.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question, and to really give a thorough answer to it, you'd have to really have an account of what religion actually is and what purposes religion serves. And so it can be addressed on a number of dimensions. I think often when people say, oh, this is, or even for that matter, what a cult is, cult has certain connotations, but actually looking into the etymology of cult, it's associated with agriculture and it's associated with culture as such. And most people don't even look into the deep etymology and say, why is the term for culture and agriculture connected to the term cult? When they think of cult, they'll think of like Charles Manson or something like that. Or
right.
So it really depends on what level one wants to address this. I think in political terms, with the kind of saying, oh, what's going on is a religion, or wokeness is a religion or has a religious character, it's meant to say, it's somewhat polemical and rhetorical, but it's meant to emphasize that this is not based on rational observation, and it's not even necessarily based on wanting to satisfy stated objectives. It's more built on fulfilling some kind of emotional need for people, or even in a broader sense, fulfilling some kind of purpose for people. And so, like, just since you mentioned I have background in academia and philosophy, I think like the deep treatment of this would have to, there's the political kind of rhetorical treatment, but the kind of philosophical treatment would have to look at something like, Nietzsche's account of, what happens when, quote unquote, God is dead, and people sort of create their own gods as substitutes or need to find some expression of purpose. And to what extent does kind of woke ideology serve that need for collective purpose, the spiritual impulses of people, as opposed to fulfilling sort of demands of efficiency or more kind of material objectives? And it's not just Nietzsche. Actually, from the philosophical point of view, there's this whole question of where modernity comes from. Is modernity, does it represent a kind of clean and dramatic break from, say, the medieval period that was governed by a more, say, quote unquote, religious sensibility of what the world was and how things had their place in it? Or was modernity not a clean break from what came before, like the scholastics in the medieval, but was it some kind of transfiguration of the same religious questions and concerns into a different vocabulary? Mm-hmm. And so, like, I think at the most sophisticated level, the question really does, like, what is religion? What does it mean to call science a religion? And to what extent is it basically the rhetorical point of, a lot of people, say, on the left or in the kind of ruling class that's governed by this worship of expertise and science that you see constantly invoked? One aspect to it could be to say, look, these people think they're being these objective, rational observers, when in fact they're not, because they're ultimately motivated by psychology and some kind of emotional impulse and need for fulfillment on that domain. But then there's, and there's some truth to that, I think. But then there's the broader point is can anything not be religion? Can anything meaningful not function ultimately as something like a religion? In which case, it's not at its deepest level a critique. It's just a question of what religion, quote unquote, is the true one and what is the best one. And it's not, what's wrong about wokeness is not that it's a religion per se, but it's not the correct religion. Right. So, yeah.
I see political correctness as kind of like what was, it had its heyday in a certain generational time that we've grown up in and so forth. And it's kind of like a parallel to the mainline denominations that were very once prominent, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian, Episcopal Church, these different powerhouse churches that then, they lost their luster because they didn't have enough firepower theologically to draw people. So they kind of became vacated, and everybody went to, more evangelical and fundamentalist versions of the religion. And people thought, in the heyday of the moral majority in the 80s and 90s, that, man, they're the ones running the show. But because they were loud and they were in the public square and they were taking on things with a lot of fervor, and everybody said, man, they're preaching at everybody. But I see a parallel between that and mainline political correctness and what we see now, which is fundamentalist wokeism, which it's preachier and it's louder, but it's not a sign of its strength. It's a sign that it's actually on its way out, because you're getting these mutations that are more squawkier and more apparently more easier seen to be religious in their fervor. And when you have to preach, you're not really in control anymore in terms of the hearts and minds of people. I mean, you look at Star Wars when it comes out, and it's preaching a kind of liberal value at the time, but it wasn't preachy. It felt like it was like organic story that's going with the hero's journey. But you look at the new Star Wars, and it's so, even people who are buying into the established religion, they're like, come on, the purple hair lady, you're trying too hard. It feels like, fundamentalist direct-to-video propaganda from the 90s. And that's not a sign of strength. That's a sign that they're on their way out. Do you see that too?
That's an interesting question. I think there's definitely a connection between this idea of, types of speech that was religiously proscribed, and how political correctness functions in this kind of sociological way and psychological way. But I think that might be just not necessarily an expression of, oh, this is a transmutation of the Puritan impulse. Like that, there is an argument for that, and I think there is some truth to that. But I think there's also truth just to, human societies cannot function without taboos. Just like in the ultimate sense, human beings cannot help but be religious. And so the question is, again, it goes to, it's like not whether something should or is religious or not, but what's the right religion. It's not whether or not we can exist without taboos, but what are the appropriate taboos. And so in that sense, there's always going to be political correctness. It's just a question of political correctness with respect to what. And I think the argument now is somewhat confused by this fact that whereas in earlier times there was not this sort of absolute value of free speech or absolute value of that this story we tell ourselves about we're a free liberal society. It was, no, this is our interpretation, say, of Revelation, and if anyone who steps outside of that is going to get crushed, and that's a good thing. Whereas in our self-understanding, our being the contemporary West, there is this hypocrisy added to that, which say, oh, we're a free country, we're a free society, we have free speech, but actually, no, we function in many ways just the way we've always functioned, in the sense we still have taboos that are very aggressively applied. It's just we have this additional layer of cognitive dissonance because of how our reigning ideology is packaged and processed. And as to the second part, whether I think the aggressive wokeness, the really in-your-face stuff, does that signal weakness? That's a tough question, because on one hand, I'm inclined to maybe say not, just because it seems like, at least in the United States, every single institution in the United States is more or less dominated by this woke ideology. So we can look at it, we can say it's crazy. There might be, a bunch of people in the center who look at the extreme manifestations of it, like the child drag queen stuff, and they say that's crazy. And that's fine, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything at the institutional level, where I think like the actual centers where power comes from, not, kind of the everyday man on the street that looks at this and say, this is insane. But also I think there's a sense in which the really extreme stuff, even though people say, oh, that's nuts, it kind of subtly helps to ossify the slightly less extreme stuff. Once we're going to say, I think this idea of multiple genders, that's crazy. I think, there are two genders, but within that, trans stuff might make sense. It's like the crazier they get, you can just be two steps down from that in terms of craziness, and you're the quote unquote conservative. And so, like, there is this sense in which the crazier it gets, even if your man on the street says, whoa, that's really nuts, it really subtly reinforces what was as normal, what was crazy just 5 years ago. And so I think that's a countervailing factor as well, just to kind of present the other side to the idea that this signifies weakness on their part.
Well, certainly we're accelerating towards something. And the question is, why does it look the way it looks? What is the transcendent that seems to be pulling us in a certain direction that's leftward, or whatever you want to call it? I think there's a war on differentiation. There's a desire to hate the body. I see a few characteristics here. You hate the physical body. You have to eliminate differentiation. So it's not about right now, 80% of engineering graduates are male. It's not enough that we get that 50-50. We have to have equity. You have to have revenge now. It has to be 80% women are graduating as engineering and 20% male before there's some kind of equitable justice. And of course, it'll change by then to something more vicious and aggressive. So there's a vengeance, there's a desire to eliminate any kind of differentiation, any kind of distinctions. Everybody's an amorphous blob, and emphasis on blob because you're supposed to hate the body. That's important. I mean, that's why people can vote for Biden and they believe I've done something for people of color. Meanwhile, Biden has spent half a century bombing, particularly people of color around the world. That's a disavowal of the human body. It's a Gnostic kind of assent. Well, he says language like, systemic racism, and that language somehow is more important than flesh and blood bodies being blown apart, particularly people of color. That's the kind of people that he's tended to predate around the globe as a loyal foot soldier for the empire. So you see that? Do you see those patterns as some of the characteristics of this religion, this globalist American empire, you call it?
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. The role of the body, and as I think is basically in one of the ideal society created in speech in Plato's Republic, the abolition of the body in a certain sense was a precondition to gender equality, which they wanted to achieve. And I think there is something to that. That's, in many ways, like the rejection of the tangible realm is some might say that's where the religious element comes from, and it could mean different things. It could mean just the utopianism as such needs to have some sort of rejection of the real world, and the body is one part of the body is this kind of the physical parameters of our existence, and part of kind of just denying basic features of reality required denying the body. And but there's another element that in this vein I think is interesting, which is there's all of that we just talked about, but then there's also this sort of hyper focus on the body. And in fact, in the vernacular of wokeness, we hear this phrase all the time: black bodies.
Yeah.
They're doing this to black bodies. This is black bodies. There's this idea of body positivity, of celebrating. It's not saying the body doesn't matter as a body and therefore it doesn't matter what your body is like. There's this active celebration of deformed bodies in this.
But that's the emphasis. The deformity is the emphasis.
Right. So it's a deformity, but it's not the rejection. It's perhaps not the rejection of the body or the corporeal as such. It might even be a rejection in an inverted sense of the ideal.
But actions speak louder than words. And if you're celebrating the junking up your body, that is a performative witness that you hate the body. You know what I mean? If you're celebrating, keep eating those Fritos, keep getting obese, you're performing a witness against your own body's worth. You're saying this is a trash dump. Celebrate. It's a trash dump. In the sexual acts, treat it like a trash dump. So there is, even you're right. There is a little bit of a nuance there, but even that, it still ends up in celebrating the abuse of the body, because the body doesn't feel good being morbidly obese. I mean, it doesn't feel good to have your limbs chopped off when you're diabetic in late stage. That doesn't feel good to the body. That's not a respect to the body. It's actually an absolute attack against the body. Yeah, which is going back to the COVID thing. I mean, look what they're doing. Oh, your body's not capable of doing natural, herd immunity. You've got to get our injections we've made in a lab. That's the only thing that can protect your body. Your body is incapable of taking care of itself. Don't worry about vitamin D. That the body doesn't know what to do with vitamin D. Don't worry about that. You'll get sunburn if you get vitamin D. So put sunscreen on. Your body can't handle vitamin D. You can't do anything. The only thing it can do is get its annual booster shot or whatever, sponsored by the corporate interests that like this regime. So everywhere you look, it's kind of a Gnostic disavowal of flesh. If you don't like the way your gender is, you can have surgery to take. And then I read this girl's horrible experience about what it felt like to have her mastectomy and her breasts removed at a young age. And she felt like she was on another planet. She felt like she was in a disembodied state outside of, it was a horrible feeling, she said. And I wanted to go reverse, she said, but she couldn't. And again, nobody's in there. And she said, I wish somebody could stop and say, hey, this is not just a celebratory thing. There's downsides to this, but nobody wants it. It's full stop. Head straight into, mangling the body, embracing these toxic seed oils for massive obesity, and a hatred of incarnational reality, which kind of goes back to what I believe is going on. I think what we're seeing here with the globalist American empire is a return of Gnostic Christianity, a heresy that's battling Christianity. Christianity puts focus on the individual human person as sacred, no matter who they are. And families are sacred from that protection of the individual. And the idea of protecting the individual against the mob, against the crowd, that's something that Christianity has brought into humanity. And I think that's trying to be repealed with a kind of hyper Christianity that's got more emphasis on language as a form of violence, rather than protecting human person and actual flesh, more importantly,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting observation.
When you look at this time, you've mentioned, I've heard in some of your discussions, that don't tread on me is not enough. That, when you compete, don't tread on me versus silence is violence. Right. Silence and violence is going to win out in the cultural world.
Yes.
What should we take away from that? I mean, what should replace don't tread on me as the response to this movement that says, if you're silent, you're committing an act of violence if you don't submit to my, ideology?
No, it's a great question. And just to kind of recap for those listeners who may not have gathered the full context from other interviews, basically my point was that part of the, I like to look at a lot of things in terms of the comparative political psychology of the left and the right. And I think that's relevant along a number of domains, including separately the special difficulties attendant to getting people on the right up to speed that every institution in this country is against them, including the national security apparatus, including the military that they worship at least at its highest levels. I think that's a particular challenge for those on the right due to features of their political psychology. But we can get to that next. For this issue, my observation was that part of the reason that the right is always in this losing position is that they're not operating from a position of moral imperialism. And I think there's a lot of virtue in that as a tendency. I'm much more of a don't tread on me, live and let live type if I just simply had my way. But we have to recognize the broader environment that we're in. And simply people who are animated by a psychology of don't tread on me versus people animated by a psychology of silence is violence, which is imperialistic in the sense that it's expansionist. Yeah. It can be in a room and the one person who isn't actively affirming your principle is a target versus exactly. And that's just always going to win. And it's related to the fact that I think the most important point there is that so much of the right politically functions as a kind of controlled opposition. And I think that there is a institutional reason for that. There are a lot of dimensions to analyze why that is. But I think one aspect of that is basically an aspect of the fact that the right, perhaps unwittingly, has really digested the moral framework of the left to the point that they think they're scoring rhetorical victories against the left by saying the left isn't meeting their own standards. They're saying, oh, the left is bad. Look at Biden. He's the real racist. Or right. Look at this. You're using terms and frameworks invented by your enemies to destroy you. Right. And so even in the rare case that you might score a temporary rhetorical victory in this one instance, what you're doing is reinforcing the valence and power of these concepts that were designed by your enemy to destroy you. And I think that's related to this idea of the right being unwilling to take a more aggressive moral stance, because so much of their moral posture, whether they admit it or not, is some kind of modified version, basically, of the morality of their enemies. And so they have to just be, oh, we're just a little bit less. We're that, but we're a little bit less. We're that, but a little bit more reasonable. Ultimately, see these Antifa people, they're nuts, and these people are nuts. But you know what? They're more like irresponsible children that have taken a just moral principle, say of equality, and they've just gone too far with it, or they've mismanaged it.
Right.
And so this idea of being, we're the sober adults and they're the misguided children, that's actually a losing position, because ultimately, if you concede, oh, these are misguided children operating on a kernel of something that's morally legitimate, their zealotry will always end up winning. And you saw that in university campus battles in the 60s, and you see that in the spineless university administrators. The quote unquote responsible adult is always going to lose against the zealotry of the student body. And you see it in big tech. Most people think, oh, big tech, the villains are always the people at the top. That's true for Google. In other cases, it's more nuanced. Are people like Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg ideological zealots for the left? I don't happen to think so. I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters, because irrespective of what they think, they're not going to go against the actively woke people one or two rungs below them who are going to cause hell if they don't go their way. So it's the moral imperialism that always wins. And so, and ultimately, the right needs to divorce itself from just being another version of the enemy's morality as a first step toward being able to adopt an alternative moral aggressiveness that's able to compete with what the left has. And that's very difficult to do. It's not an easy thing. So it's not just a matter of substituting the slogan. It's a matter of a complete overhaul of one's moral orientation toward things.
And of course, the problem also is that the American establishment, the founding of this country was a liberal project. It was a revolutionary spirited project. And so what's happening 1776 versus 1619 is it's just really continuing that same revolutionary zeal of, hey, time to overthrow that founding moment and create a new order that's even more potently liberal in the sense of the emancipation of victims from oppression. And so you've got this, you're already playing the game of trying to slow down the emancipation, formula by saying, well, we like the classical liberal moment. We don't like the new liberal moment. Well, how are you going to win? I mean, it's naturally, you're already assuming a framework that's kind of like an outdated form of what the current version of this revolutionary spirit is, and of course, it's a big time difference, but like you're saying, don't tread on me. That was a slogan that worked for its time, but there's been a lot of treading on me since then. So the project that the founders tried to do, it was very powerful and beautiful in some ways in terms of its restraint on avarice and so forth and ambition to some degree. Of course, you could argue that there was a little bit of a coup there with the Constitution against the spirit of the decentralized republic that was established at first. But nevertheless, it's lost a little bit of its teeth. There's no, like what you're describing with Tucker Carlson being spied on by our government and they can go in and do whatever they want. They're treading on all of us anytime they want. And so we might have to think of a different way of approaching this, right?
Right. I don't think "Don't tread on me" is, it's not so much about the slogan, although I think this slogan isn't great, but it's about the moral psychology that animates it. And I don't think it is. I think it's something that resonates with a lot of people, including myself. I don't think that it is equipped to deal with the challenges that we have today.
Does that mean for you in building a future a cultural movement that challenges this left project, this globalist cultural moment? Does that mean that we need to abandon negative liberty, the concept of negative liberty? Because when you say "don't tread on me," that's kind of a negative liberty slogan, as opposed to positive liberty of, it's the state's role to provide us a house and to provide us these positive rights. I have a right to this food. I have a right to that medicine. I have a right to your labor to build me a home. That's a positive right concept. And, when we say "don't tread on me," it's a kind of emphasis that no, negative liberty is more important than these positive rights, these assertions of do we need to change that framework a little bit and implement positive right concepts by force, or is there something else you have in mind in that?
I mean, it depends. It would be a case by case thing in relation to issues. I think the negative, the negative liberty issue is it's associated with classical liberalism that presupposes, okay, we have these rights that we're entitled to, and there's only certain exceptions to that where we delegate out certain rights to the government for basic protections and so forth. Like there's a more or less coherent system in place to account for that. It's just profoundly detached from the actual country that we live in. Right. I mean, like whether or not it was ever kind of attached, now it's certainly not attached, given how there's like, forget about the relationship of government to or state government to people, because state governments are extremely powerful. Like at this point, I think it does mean something to say, okay, state power versus federal power, but even state powers, over the individual are quite strong. But it basically, the whole idea of federalism is completely gone, and so many of these old ideas that kind of animated the structure of how American government works are totally transformed, and that's going to happen over a course of hundreds of years. But it's just this idea, like insofar as the negative liberty, I know it has a sort of it has a philosophical side. It goes to actually, people say, oh, Locke is the negative liberty guy and Rousseau is the positive liberty, and there are a lot of ways you can kind of proxy out the negative versus positive. But insofar as this is related to, say, being the small government conservative, or that's right. In a way, I think, like in a sense, I think that is an extremely relevant attitude to have, because right now the government, the national security state, I think, is the chief offender, and we don't want to do anything to empower the national security state. So now I think it's a good idea not to promote like huge defense budgets or huge budgets for this government that wants to really destroy you. In the case of recently, the DHS and all these other organizations have declared basically all Trump supporters as domestic terrorists. Right. So in that sense, like insofar as small government conservative can be a proxy for, I don't want to empower the government to destroy me, then that makes sense. But small government conservative implies that we can implies a lot of other things, like, the corporate side is okay, the private sector versus public sector, and all these other things that at the highest level in terms of power don't really translate, I think, into an effective posture. And so so again, that's why I said it depends on the issue. I think it's very important to be aware that the threats come from the national security state. I don't know if a lot of that prepackaged sort of libertarian vocabulary about being small government conservative, I don't know how effective that's going to be. I think more you just recognize where the threat is and don't be shackled by any type of ideology. You have to have a flexibility with respect to ideology and simply focus on what are the sectors going after me, and how do I weaken those sectors as I empower myself and my allies, and
Yeah.
whatever kind of quote unquote ideology facilitates that, or no ideology at all, that would be the way to go.
So in order, I'm of the opinion that, I call myself a political atheist, that at some point we've got to stop believing in the gods behind the curtains of DC and recognize that, even though it's a kind of utopian thing to imagine, and Capistan, it's also kind of utopian to imagine that you can staff the morally pure people all in this labyrinthine bureaucracy in DC and get it all right. I don't think it's going to happen that way either, which leads me to conclude that perhaps, the battle, unfortunately, with that whole cliche is going to be in the world of culture. And if it's in the world of culture, that means we've got to tell a better story than the story that's on offer by the establishment. So, what is that story that you believe in or are looking for that can propel our culture to be bound together? I mean, some people, Trump tried the whole America, 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 and that has a certain power. But I almost feel like the way he presented America with the singing of the children sing, Donald Trump is our star, this kind of kitschy kind of stuff. It felt like a reunion tour for a hair band from the 80s that was having big stadiums, but it wasn't going to actually carry the culture forward. It's more about remembering the greatest hits. That's how it felt to me. So what do you think is a story that can bind us together to propel us into the future so we can have a family-friendly society and a liberty-based society and a peaceful society?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And of course, it's always much easier to point out the stories that don't work than to actually advance a story that could do that type of heavy lifting. And I guess there are a number of candidates, but ultimately, at the moment, I don't know if there's a story that I think is ready-made at the moment that could do that type of heavy lifting. And it's a problem, but it's not something to despair about. It's just sort of taking things one step at a time and recognizing, really where the bottlenecks to, being able to advance a story like that, if one were to have it. The problems with the family, the technology is a big, there are all kinds of advancements in society that are not political, at least in the sense that we understand them, that are profoundly disruptive to healthy family formation in the way that it's traditionally understood. So how does one overcome that? Does that story have to involve, does the story need to facilitate some kind of reactionary posture? And by reactionary, I don't mean that in a negative sense. I simply mean going back to the old types of family structure that would work. And does that require some kind of extreme, Luddite sensibility? And is that a good thing? Is that a realistic thing? Versus, does it require just not on the political level, winning the political fight, which is very, very difficult in itself, but those structural issues related to technology and sort of deep changes in society, does that involve sort of this kind of almost neo-Tocquevillian project of, and when I say Tocquevillian, a lot of people use that in different ways. What I mean is, when Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, he wrote it acknowledging that the aristocratic order was done. He was an anti-reactionary in that sense. He was saying, look, the aristocratic order is done. You might like it, you might not like it, but there are structural features in place, meaning that we're not going to go back. Democracy is here, and I'm looking at how it's practiced in the United States, and I'm looking at it with a view toward what were the valuable features of aristocracy, and how can those features, how can democracy fulfill the essence of those features, or what version is compatible with democracy that fulfills the same need? And so it's rethinking. It's not saying how can we copy and paste aristocracy onto democracy, but what is lost in the aristocracy? What is of value that's lost? There's some bad things that are lost. What's of value that's lost? And how do we find substitutes for that that are compatible with the democratic ethos? And so I think there might be a similar type of requirement, is to really understanding the kind of conservative disposition in this traditional sense of looking at what's valuable in the old orders that's been completely uprooted, maybe understanding that it's not realistic to restore that at any kind of scale of civilization, but being sober and respectful and discerning about what was lost, and thinking, okay, how do we create substitute versions in that are faithful to the new political possibilities of the future? And I think the story that you're talking about will have to emerge over that process. But there's so many things blocking us from even being able to think that way. And that's where the political stuff comes, because as you pointed out, the woke stuff is just more and more destruction. And so and the fact that that's captured all of our institutions have made it very difficult to even undertake that new sort of Tocquevillian thinking, because the order is totally dominated by destruction and ugliness and chaos that would prevent the sort of rethinking that I described. And so it's like that big political difficulty is layered on top of a profound kind of philosophical difficulty of, to use the evil word of the Great Reset people and the abolished police people, of reimagining like what not stepping outside of the bounds of human nature and what's appropriate to human nature, but reimagining what possibilities there are for human fulfillment in relation to human nature that kind of understand the new situation we're in with all of the changes that have happened from technology, from the economy, and so forth.
I think whatever story we come up with and tell ourselves, it's going to have to reckon with the story about the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. I think that's the thing that haunts us in our society. I think that's why the victim is the sacred place, because, what Jesus inaugurated 2,000 years ago, where he started to disrupt the sacrificial order of societies. And if he was merely a man, it was the greatest miracle one could imagine, because it's still unfolding to this day as we continue to be haunted by what we perceive to be oppression and victims, some of it real, some of it imagined. And we're haunted by this. And I think that's what's playing out today, is this theological civil war, or a fight against a Gnostic version that wants to revivify sacrificial violence that Jesus disrupted on the cross, versus hopefully something that can emerge, which can honor the body and challenge sacrificial violence, and do so in a way that really, scratches the itch for our culture's need to reconcile with its abuses. I think people are haunted by the fact that they've been perpetuating a decadent empire that's got a lot of bodies all over the world that didn't need to die in many different ways, not just war, not just the sanctions, not just this stupid lockdown stuff. They've got a body bag that's astronomically high, and we don't want to reconcile with that. We don't want to look at that face to face. And so we come up with these Gnostic delusions to numb ourselves. I want to ask you just as we wrap up here, you created Revolver. You founded this project recently, and it got tweeted out by the last president, Trump, and all these different people are paying attention to what you're doing. What do you see your role as a member of the media? You obviously have a desire to get in media. You're here, you're in it. What's your role? What do you see your goal here?
Well, I think whether it was my original intention or not, I think it's clear what the main function of Revolver is, at least up to this point. But I think it's going to be this way. And of course, Revolver.news originally gained a lot of attention as a substitute for Drudge Report. And most people still, they use it like that because it's just got great links every day, and people go there multiple times a day just to stay informed on political news. That's the beating heart of the site, and it's extremely important. As for the reporting side, we've gained tremendous amount of attention nationally for reporting on, say, the color revolution and thesis. And if people have heard about that, we didn't invent the term color revolution, but to the extent that it's now more or less a part of our everyday political vernacular, I think that owes a lot to Revolver's reporting and the subsequent reporting by Tucker Carlson and so forth. And we've broken stories on sort of the woke developments within the military. This guy called Bishop Garrison, who is this rabid Trump hater who was appointed into the Pentagon as the ideological veteran chief for our entire military. We broke that. That became huge. And most recently, we've gained tremendous attention for our reporting on 1/6. And the 1/6 issue, getting to the bottom of that is not simply an issue of justice for all of those detained as political prisoners. It's really about 70 million people plus in the United States who've been declared de facto domestic terrorists by their government, and using 1/6, a false narrative of 1/6, to advance that agenda of this new domestic war on terror. And by exposing the lies of that, we hope to undermine that narrative. But the thread that connects all of those things, going back to the color revolution, is something I alluded to earlier. Is getting the political right in the broader sense. When I say right, I mean conservatives, populists, even functionally people on the left who are not on board with the ruling class. They're functionally part of the right because they're targets. But to get people on the right in the broadest sense up to speed with the fact that right now, in what I call the globalist American empire, every single institution is hostile to them, including the national security state. And I think that's very hard because I think the political psychology of the left, to be generous to them, they need to think of themselves as criticizing and attacking unjust institutions of power. I think they rarely do that. I think now mostly they serve unwittingly or not as instruments of those institutions of power. But they need to think of themselves as attacking unjust institutions of power. Whereas I think people on the right are different. People on the right like to think of themselves as venerating just institutions of authority. And so it's much more in line with the left political psychology to engage in a critique of the national security state than it is on the right, because a lot of people on the right, they traditionally would think of the FBI, if not the CIA, then the FBI as a just institution of authority to respect, or even to the police, which is more complicated than just police good, everyone else bad, or police bad and good. It's more complicated than that. But just this idea of, we back the blue simply, that's an expression of that just need to venerate just institutions of authority. Or to the military, which is now, through our reporting on Bishop Garrison and others, been just as corrupt as any other institution, if not more, at the highest levels. That's perhaps the hardest pill for people on the right to swallow, because there's no, what's more venerable than the United States military? And so, whereas it's so easy for the left to critique the military, it's just a different proposition. It clashes directly with all of the inertia, all of the momentum, and the basic characteristics of the right political psychology. But it has to be done. Otherwise, the right is going to be venerating, supporting, and defending institutions that have been co-opted, corrupted, and are now actively hostile to them and bent on their destruction. And so the common thread throughout all of our investigative reporting, at least on those issues that I think is a key feature of what Revolver is about, is getting conservatives, getting the right up to speed on the fact that the national security state is no longer their friend. And even the military at its higher levels is not necessarily their friend. And to understand that the biggest threat in our politics, in our society, is this fact that the national security apparatus has been repurposed and redeployed domestically in order to silence and suppress and destroy the energies associated with Donald Trump. Even if people don't like Trump, the energies associated with a movement like that, the national security apparatus is now repurposed to destroy those things. And that is a very difficult thing to do. But I think we're having substantial success, and we're of course being helped by, I think Tucker Carlson is doing this very well on the cable news stage. I don't know if anyone else is doing this on cable TV in the way that he is. And so in that sense, we have the same agenda.
Should the right reciprocate with what they're doing, or should we just speak truth to power, reveal what the oppression is, reveal the overreach, reveal the ugliness, and allow it to fall on its own weight? You know what I mean? Should they do a long march of the institutions to get their version of Bishop Garrison or whatever in that position one day on that great, beautiful morning 30 years from now? Or should they just act? Should they speak bluntly? Should they speak directly about oppression, but then use a different technique about allowing it to be defeated? Maybe jujitsu, aikido,
I mean, we're a while from that. Like I'm not one that would adhere to any kind of ideological rigidity on those things. I think to some extent, the right needs to embrace a sort of ruthless pragmatism with respect to rewarding friends and undermining enemies. And that could certainly, involve, like, if someone's in a position to be in the military or even be in the CIA or the FBI and maybe do some good, I'm not one to say, oh, one should simply leave on principle. If you can do more good for your side, so to speak, within these institutions, then by all means, that's the way to go. And so it's like different people will have to find the right approach based on their position in life, based on their talents and inclinations and so forth. So there's no one kind of approach other than helping friends and harming enemies, so to speak. So not sure if that answers the question directly, but certainly infiltrating the institutions is not a bad thing. Do I think that that's like the only way to do it, or is that where to put all your eggs in that basket? Probably not. We want multiple baskets.
So thank you for your time. And where can people, what are some stories that people can look forward to or follow at Revolver.news that are coming out soon?
Well, we have continuing coverage on 1/6, as you probably saw. Revolver News's first piece on the unindicted persons referenced in the 1/6 charging documents that gained national attention, and the mainstream media just went insane over this, basically suggesting that there are people in the charging documents of 1/6 referenced but not indicted. And in some of those cases, I think it's far more likely than not that we're dealing with either FBI informants or agents, or maybe not the FBI. People think the FBI is the only agency that does this. There's Army counterintelligence, there's Joint Terrorism Task Force, and so forth. Could be those agencies. And as part of a kind of to reinforce people's intuitions as to whether or not this could be possible, we brought up this Michigan kidnapping plot that a lot of people had forgotten. It's this plot that happened in Michigan just months before the so-called storming of the Capitol, that involved a plot to storm the Michigan state capitol. It involved one of the same key militia groups imputed to 1/6. And at the time that we drew attention to this plot and its parallels to 1/6, we knew that 5 out of the 18 people alleged to have participated in that plot, 5 out of 18 were federal agents, which even at the time was a hell of a ratio. It's now come to light that the true number is 12 out of 18. And just in case people are wondering if they heard that right, yes, 12 out of the 18 plotters in the Michigan kidnapping, storming of the Capitol plot were feds. 12 out of 18.
That's enough to start a union.
That's incredible. No, you're right. It's a hell of a ratio. And even BuzzFeed, which is not a friendly outlet, did a quite good, I must say, piece basically reinforcing Revolver.news' earlier coverage on this and saying, look, not only this is a hell of a ratio, but all of the key elements of this conspiracy, all of the key overt acts in this conspiracy were conducted by the informants and agents, such that without the informants and agents, there very likely wouldn't be a conspiracy. And this looks like it could very well be a case of entrapment. Now, what's amazing is that they'll look at this and they won't ask the question that we asked. It's like, how could it be? Oh, by the way, an interesting detail. The person in charge of this infiltration operation, who headed the FBI field office in Detroit, just days after these 18 plotters were arrested, 12 of whom were agents anyway, days after 18 people, these plotters were arrested, Christopher Wray, head of the FBI, promoted the Stephen D'Antuono, who was head of the infiltration operation, to the DC field office, where he went on to oversee January 6 cases, which is a very suspicious and overlooked development. And so we're supposed to believe that the feds were so up in the ass of all these people in Michigan who were doing the same thing, like storming the Capitol, all this same militia, and they were up in their ass to 12 out of 18. And yet January 6 is this unprecedented intelligence failure, that even though they knew that there was a certification going on, that Trump was going to speak, that they were tracking all of these militia groups, that somehow on this special day, the Capitol had uniquely poor security. And this is just this intelligence failure. It beggars belief. And that's just to reinforce intuition. In the Revolver.news pieces, we go in detail looking at 1/6 specifically, and in some cases, specific individuals, making a case that at the high levels, this was something very similar to what we now know Michigan was. Namely, this was an intelligence setup, not an intelligence failure. So we're going to follow up on this story and keep pursuing it until, more and more vindication comes in, and it keeps pouring in, and it's been pouring in for months, starting with Brian Sicknick, the officer whom they said was bludgeoned to death with a fire extinguisher. We refuted that. New York Times retracted it. So the media is just playing catch up on this.
And I haven't heard as much about those 2 officers, the Capitol Police, that committed suicide. Whatever happened with that story?
That's look, there are a lot of interesting stories in there that might be pursued. A lot of interesting a lot of interesting parallels. And again, this is the kind of conversation that the right isn't used to. Like, people on the left understand the abuse of the FBI informant process. They know that there's a lot of abuse going on, even the war on terror against Muslims and so forth. A lot of people don't know. We in one of our sort of side reports, we did say, here are the top 5 cases of just informants going too far to the point where they're actively involved in these terror plots. And the first World Trade Center bombing, the bomb was actually built by an informant. A lot of people don't know that. It's a remarkable thing. It's simply verifiable. People can go and check it. It's not some conspiracy thing. It's simply a matter of public record. Remarkable. And it's not even really an outlier. There's a lot of peculiar things about Oklahoma City as well. And so it's just.
What was the gentleman's name that died in a suicide allegedly? What was the story with that?
I think you're thinking of a guy called Terrence Yeakey.
And he died how? He killed himself, or? Well,
the official story is he killed himself. Nobody believed that. Up until very recently, even his Wikipedia page, and Wikipedia is hyper sanitized politically, even his Wikipedia page made it clear that there's no way this was a suicide. I drew attention to this person's case, Terrence Yeakey, on Twitter, and then after that, the Wikipedia page became sanitized. But anyone who cares to look in the details themselves, I think anyone with sober judgment can come to their own conclusions. Gentleman's name is Terrence Yeakey, and it's a very interesting rabbit hole to go down.
If he died a brutal death, that seems like that should be something that, since we're looking at history again, like the Tulsa riots and everything, and the terrible, horrible thing there, we should look at Terrence Yeakey and find out justice for Terrence Yeakey. Don't you think that would be a good social justice thing to get research on? To figure out.
Right. I mean,
there needs to be a BLM needs to put his face out there and start raising attention about why he was murdered, perhaps.
Oh, right. And the second BLM does that, we would no longer hear BLM. That would be, if you want to eliminate BLM, get them to embrace Terrence Yeakey. That's the new strategy. We want to defeat BLM. Just get them to embrace Terrence Yeakey, and that'll do it. That'll do it in a second. But no, it's very interesting, and it's not just interesting from an historical perspective. It's relevant now because one of the individuals involved in some of these sordid events surrounding Oklahoma City was our current Attorney General, Merrick Garland. He was deeply involved in that. And again, this is something that people can look up. This is on the public record, and it's celebrated. They say, oh, Merrick Garland, who has a history of being involved in cases of domestic terrorism like Oklahoma City. And so that's no secret. It's just that there are a lot of very fishy aspects of the Oklahoma City situation that a lot of people just don't know for various reasons. But yeah, Merrick Garland was part of that. Another individual was part of that was Eric Holder. So, I mean, it's just a side interest. If your listeners happen to be interested in this, that's what the internet is for. There's still some parts of the internet that are free. It's not what it was 5 years ago, but if you're sufficiently resourceful, you can find the facts if you want to.
Well, Darren Beattie, it's been great speaking with you, and people can check out Revolver.news to follow some of these stories you've talked about, and keep up what you're doing. It's important to do investigative research, and I think it's a way to bring left and right and independent together. This is what people with a conscience care about, is the truth, and they care about understanding where acts of oppression may have been hidden right in plain sight,
Absolutely. And great discussion. Thanks for having me, and let's do this again.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.